Well, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Dan Rossiter. I'm one of the sector leads here at the British Standards Institution, and I'm very excited to have you with us to celebrate the launch of PAS 8700, a new standard focusing on modern methods of construction. We've got a very busy, tightly packed schedule for today with some great speakers, and what I'm going to do is just briefly go over some of the housekeeping before we begin. So the first thing is that this is a listen-only webinar. What that means is you can't interact with us by turning on your camera or speaking, but there are plenty of ways in which you can interact with us. The first is using the Q&A function. If you look on the top right-hand side of your screen, there should be an option for you to be able to put in any questions that you want asked. You can use those for a number of things. The first is you can use it for any technical difficulties. Say that the sound goes a bit funny or things appear to be unsynced, or for whatever reason you can't see the slides. Use the Q&A feature to be able to ask those sorts of questions, and someone from our team will look to support you as best as they can. At the same time, you can ask subject matter questions. And what we'll be doing today is that after the presentations, we've got a period of time to do some Q&A. So you'll be able to ask your questions to the experts, and I'll moderate those questions and we'll go through them and answer as many as we can. Upon completing the event today, you should receive an email asking for some feedback. Once you complete the feedback survey, you'll have a link available to you so you can re-watch the webinar. So there'll be an on-demand link, and with the same mechanism is how you're able to get a CPD certificate if that is something that is important to you. So lots of ways that you can engage with us, and we hope that you ask many questions or any questions that are burning issues for you as we go through today's presentations. A quick look at today's agenda. You'll see that we're having me first to do the welcome and introduction, which is happening right now as we speak. After which we'll introduce a short video from Minister Alex Norris, who will talk a bit about the standard in that way, and we thank the Minister very much for his time in pre-recording something for us. After which we'll hear from Suzanne, one of the technical authors from Studio Partington, who will give us an overview of PAS 8700 and some of the involvements that they've had with it. Afterwards, we'll hear some industry perspectives from Dirk from Build Offsite, and then we'll have Richard, one of the other technical authors from Studio Partington, also join us for the Q&A, at which point then we will go through all your questions at the end of the session. We have some questions that you've submitted in advance. Thank you very much for those. We'll go through them as well as any live questions that we receive as part of that end bit, so that we can finish cleanly for 2 o'clock. So that's the agenda and that's the plan that we've got. So what I'll do is I'll pause here, and to start us off, here's the video from Minister Alex Norris at MHCLG.
Thank you for inviting me to open the PAS 8700 launch event. I'd like to start by thanking the British Standards Institution, the steering group and all those who contributed, including the Building Safety Regulator, the Health and Safety Executive, manufacturers, warranty and assurance providers, insurance and lending bodies, academic experts, architects, MMC trade bodies, fire safety experts and all those involved in the public consultation to develop this new PAS. I'm aware, and you can tell by all those groups involved there, the huge amount of time and effort that's gone into this project, and it would not have been possible without the expert knowledge and commitment of all those involved. So thank you very much for doing that. Now, as you'll know, this government is committed to tackling the housing crisis, and that's why we've committed to building 1.5 million homes over this Parliament. And increasing the adoption of modern methods of construction is critical to meeting this target by boosting productivity in the sector, helping address construction skills shortages that we face, and improving building performance. Of course, comes with huge economic impact to local communities as well. So this government is focused on removing barriers to growth and investment in the sector, including stimulating a pipeline of demand, supporting the interpretation of building regulations and giving clarity for warranty and assurance providers. And with PAS 8700, that now provides a unified specification for off-site construction. It sets the standard for procurement, design, manufacture, construction and use of safe, resilient and repairable residential MMC buildings. It addresses the need for greater consistency, it will help reduce supply chain risks and allow suppliers to yield greater benefits from the manufacturing process while protecting innovation and intellectual property. This work aligns with the government's priorities across building safety and will build a stronger, more trusted regulatory system that delivers safe, quality homes for all. PAS 8700 is an industry-leading standard created by the sector which will pave the way for innovative construction. For it to achieve the success that your hard work warrants, we must use it all now in our future developments and programmes. And so I call on us to begin that process now, as together we can use it to deliver the homes, jobs and opportunities our country needs and deserves. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Minister Norris, for those kind words. We hope to live up to them. So up next, we've got Suzanne, one of our technical authors. Suzanne will kindly introduce herself and then provide an overview of PAS 8700. Suzanne, over to you. It appears Suzanne's trying to find the camera button perhaps for a second. So what I will do is briefly remind you of how interactive this session is going to be so that you can ask many of your questions. There you are, Suzanne.
Thank you, Dan. Apologies about that. Sorry, everyone. Hello. It's good to join you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So as Dan's explained, I'm going to give a flavour of the PAS and hopefully encourage you to read and adopt it. And then Richard, my co-author here, is going to join for questions later after the presentations. So if we can move on to our first slide, please. So a PAS is a publicly available fast track standard which can be revised. It's not a technically detailed construction industry document, but more a general process specification that applies to all forms of construction and materials. It's also addressed to all stakeholders, including non-technical ones, and will be helpful for commissioning clients, designers in the broadest sense of the word, and the MMC industry. So MMC is a catch-all umbrella term, which as a group we gave up trying to find a simple written definition for. It's worth bearing in mind that the MMC definition framework, the 7 categories of MMC, includes site process improvements and use of technology, kind of things that I think of as marginal gains, to borrow a term from sport, as well as the volumetric or panelised off-site construction, which usually springs to mind when MMC is mentioned. So in summary, this PAS aims to support all stakeholders, is material and MMC category agnostic, and it covers a whole project lifecycle, including maintenance and disassembly, and provides clear practical requirements for both entire building systems and individual elements. As you can imagine, this breadth was a real challenge to write about. So moving on. So MMC has been deployed effectively in some parts of the construction industry, but we've also seen the collapse and closure of MMC house builders and the House of Lords inquiry. This PAS answers some of these issues, providing a consistent framework for safe and effective use of MMC. Following the PAS will help realise the full benefits of MMC. One of the things we learned through the process is this starts much earlier than you may realise, with aggregation of demand, procurement and value-based decisions. It'll also improve the quality and guard against failure through design flexibility. The context to this is the housing industry looking to adopt innovative building approaches to meet national demands to reach the 1.5 million new homes. Moving on. So Richard and I both work for Studio Partington, and we're authors and architects. As a practice, over many years, we've delivered multiple MMC projects, including in the last 15 years, Dermanthorpe New Community, which incorporates a host of innovation under the surface of an award-winning housing development and includes 4 types of MMC: student accommodation and social housing retrofit. We've worked with different materials and forms of construction, which include timber frame and panel, SIPs, light gauge steel, precast concrete and insulated concrete formwork, and help gain system accreditation for 2 MMC disruptors. On the PAS, we were assisted by an incredible steering group of experts from diverse fields, and I can't stress enough how developing the PAS was an extremely collaborative, consensus-building process, and want to give our appreciation and kudos to the amazing steering group. Moving on, please. So the PAS sets a best practice standard for setting up either a project deploying an MMC system or a program of MMC delivery. And the organisation of the PAS, as you can see from the contents list here, walks through a project using MMC. It's worth pointing out that MMC projects are not so different. They're built out of the same materials and meet the same standards as traditional ones. The PAS highlights differences in timing and process, people required and their expertise, and different locations or activities. For instance, testing and inspection, which happens partly in a factory rather than a muddy site. So I'm not able to cover everything in this session, but I want to pick out a couple of sections where there was a lot of input from the steering group experts, although it's hard to pick. So as you can see on the left of the slide here, the introduction is maybe more detailed than sometimes introductions are, and it's a really key part of the document because it helps to foster better understanding of all stakeholders. And then section 4 I'd characterise as being about getting the right people at the right time and ensuring that those people are competent and experienced in MMC. And then this important section goes on to help define roles and responsibilities and make sure that critical interfaces are covered. And those interfaces can be physical ones between components, but also between organisations. Sections 5 and 6 cover MMC specific and interrelated processes, which of optioneering, system selection, and system description. And then section 7 covers delivery and storage, which is where we know these are like new processes within an MMC project compared to a traditional one. And it's where we know that things can go wrong, like last mile logistics, for example. Moving on, please. So I'm now going to talk to some key diagrams which explain the concepts behind the PAS and highlight some key content where we were particularly helped by the steering group. The terminology and processes developed in other construction sectors, for instance infrastructure, are now being adopted in house building policy. The PAS introduction helps explain these concepts and set them in context. So for instance, figure 1, which is shown on the slide, shows industrialised and off-site construction underpinned by something known as design for manufacture and assembly, or DFMA. It was a lesson for us as authors that the twin concerns of how a component is manufactured and how it is assembled need to be considered at all project stages, even as early as procurement and feasibility studies. And finally, this diagram, if you look at the bottom of it, is also a reminder that not all MMC involves off-site construction, as I mentioned earlier. Moving on, please. So this is another key diagram included in the introduction. The PAS refers to the REBA plan of work stages, but recognises that MMC projects, particularly those that deploy already designed MMC systems or product platforms, do not necessarily follow a linear process, and stages can be streamlined or overlap. For instance, technical design can be complete before feasibility is undertaken. However, solutions must be tailored to a specific project, the brief and site, and project-specific fire and health and safety concerns. For clarity, where we can, we emphasise the activity rather than the stage number, and following the PAS does not require the adoption of the REBA plan. This figure 2, which is represented on the slide, is an infinity loop diagram, which shows the relationship between the development of an MMC system or product platform on the left and the deployment of that MMC system on the right through the 8 REBA stages. And this deployment project loop is centred on value-based decisions, which go beyond the immediate concerns of construction cost or time to support better whole life outcomes. So as a whole, this diagram shows the potential to aggregate demand, how pre-designed and available systems influence the design process and project setup, and how feedback from completed projects drives system development and overall systemic improvement. Moving on, please. So the skills for selecting MMC options are not generally acquired during professional construction training. The DFMA overlay to the REBA plan of work identifies a new role of an MMC advisor, which is then reinforced in PAS 8700. This is in the early stages as a strategic role to provide support and challenge preconceptions. And then in the later stages, from REBA stage 3, more technical expertise is required. The role could be filled by a design team member, project manager, a separate MMC consultant, or the system manufacturer. And it might need to be different individuals at different project stages. And then something else to point out that's illustrated here on this slide is if you're not familiar with reading a PAS, you will see in the excerpt that there is green italicized text, which is explanatory and helpful background for all readers. And then this text accompanies the normative specification clauses, which all must include a shall requirement, which is another drafting challenge. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So design freeze is a concept which all designers will be familiar with, but is particularly important for the MMC industry in fixing design for manufacture. Generally, earlier decisions are likely to bring greater value, and late changes fundamentally undermine the viability of an MMC project. Figure 4 on the slide describes a low-rise housing scheme or turnkey MMC solution and highlights design activities and interfaces. How Figure 4 is arranged and what's included reflects 3 recurring themes within the PAS. Firstly, identifying what is different for an MMC project. Secondly, helping define who should take responsibility, particularly for interfaces, as you've heard me mention before, between physical components and also organisations. And thirdly, pointing out common issues, which we call here watch points, that our experienced steering group have seen in all aspects of project delivery. So coming back to design freeze, as well as an important design freeze prior to manufacture, there are also multiple design freezes, and the number, timing and purpose can vary and needs to be agreed for each project. Coordinating designs to a high level of detail relatively early, those design freezes and pre-order dates, as well as lead times, need to be factored into a project programme. Next slide, please. So we're aware that this PAS is being published at a time of fundamental reform of building legislation throughout the UK, and guidance is being updated. The PAS does not reproduce fire safety requirements that exist elsewhere. However, it is aligned with recent publications, for instance, BS 9991 and quadruple nine. We do point out recurring misunderstandings about the role and applicability of statutory guidance, by which we mean approved document B in England, for instance. And to be clear about that, so statutory guidance is primarily focused on protection of life. And Table of 1 identifies recognised approaches to fire safety and highlights where property protection and business continuity are not or either more or less within the scope of guidance or approaches. MMC projects meet the same fire safety standards as traditional ones, but insurance, warranty and ongoing management requirements need timely consideration. Next slide, please. From the steering group, we discovered that there are certain aspects of fire and structural design that may not be covered by existing codes, and demonstrating compliance may include an element of designing from first principles and testing. On the other hand, there are also simple systems using technology and verified tests that are well established and understood by building control bodies. Clause 6.4 covers these more common low-rise situations and is mainly concerned with defining responsibility and assessing suitability of existing structural design or test information. With considerable help from iStruct-E, we have included Annex D, which is highlighted on the slide, with additional normative structural requirements for tall, large or complex buildings. Because of the flexibility of a PAS, there is potential to include more normative annexes in future versions, focused on particular MMC category or material, for instance. Next, final slide, please. Although the House of Lords inquiry and various industry casualties brought bad press, this PAS reflects the extraordinary expertise and resources within the MMC industry, as demonstrated by the steering group experts and MMC champions we got to work with. It builds on this collective knowledge acquired from successful projects and provides a standardized specification and best practice framework to allow this success to be replicated. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Suzanne. Thank you very much for that. It's really interesting to hear from you as one of the technical authors. As someone personally who does an awful lot with terminology, I thought that aspect about Figure 1 explaining the relationship between things like platforms, DFMA, offsite, and MMC, a very useful addition. I hope the presentation generates a lot of questions. I do see a couple of questions have already come in, so thank you for those. Keep them coming. Up next, we have Dirk from Build Offsite, who will kindly introduce himself and provide an industry perspective. Dirk, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the introduction. And I am the CEO for Syria, which manages Build Offsite, and I'm here speaking on behalf of Build Offsite as one of their executive directors. So the first slide is really intended to be an introduction to those who might not be familiar with Syria and Build Offsite, but also to give you the context for why we are here. We're here to really express our congratulations to BSI for delivering this standard, and Richard and Suzanne in particular should be applauded for the sterling efforts they put into this PAS. But it's also really wanting to reflect how closely aligned our thinking is with PAS 8700. And this slide shows you that we were the first MMC network to be set up 20 years ago to promote MMC. And our mission has always been and still is to be the trusted independent voice for the MMC industry, supporting our members and key stakeholders like MH, CLG and BSI. And the next slide that you just saw earlier is a reflection of our membership. And it's a wide range of membership covering housing, property, retail, all the way through to transport and water infrastructure. And you can see we are quite unique in terms of bringing together the clients who are implementing MMC and their supply chain, including SME manufacturers who are innovative and pioneering at the leading edge of our industry. Next slide, please. In terms of what we do for our members, I don't know if that was reflected on this slide, but I think the previous slide showed that we essentially have 4 key priorities for our members: influencing policy, influencing the MMC agenda, collaborating for impact, and I think PAS 8700 is a prime example of that, but also demonstrating good practice and building knowledge, and I'll come back to that. And on influencing, it's hot off the press. We've published it this morning. It's our 5-year Build Offsite manifesto, which has got clear asks for government. And as the minister just mentioned, the government wants to reduce barriers to economic growth, and it wants to stimulate a pipeline in housing. And that's exactly what our members are wanting us to help address, because we feel a lack of pipeline and a lack of scale is what needs to be tackled, and it's a top priority for our members. We're also keen to pursue the government's agenda on driving net zero carbon and digital transformation through MMC. But we do believe more financial incentives and policy support are still needed. And as you can see from these slides, the asks that we've come up with cover a range, funnily enough, quite a few asks which are reflected in the PAS, in the PAS 8700. And it includes setting up a robust standard, which obviously PAS 8700 is, but also implementing accreditation. And Build Offsite set up BOPAS, the Build Offsite Property Assurance Scheme, 12 years ago, and we therefore are pushing accreditation as much as possible, as you can see from the slide that I showed earlier. But we also are welcoming PAS's advice, recommendation from just earlier, the appointment and training of MMC advisors. If they could promote this on their major projects, then the government would really be helping our industry. But we also want the government to start tackling the skills shortages by having a dedicated workforce development initiative, which includes MMC training for the whole construction industry. And if we move on to the next slide, you can see what I referred to earlier. Build Offsite is always trying to demonstrate good practice in building knowledge. And every year we publish 1 or 2 guidance documents. This year we're publishing good practice in improving the management of intellectual property and procurement, as well as improving the use of performance specifications in MMC, a key manifesto ask for us. And the guide that you can see on the slide, BSI in the shape of Dan Roster, has helped to deliver, which will be coming out very soon. And the Minister mentioned that the PAS is protecting IP and setting the standard on procurement. So this is really timely to follow the Minister's remarks with a publication on IP, hopefully sometime in the autumn. And it is an important point I want to stress here that we believe an agnostic approach is really key to shaking up the current procurement models and mitigating the negative impacts of fluctuating demand. Because with MMC output, it's often forgotten, it's not tied or dependent on one vendor. You really need to see procurement as being enabled by this DFMA approach that Suzanne mentioned, whereby products and components are manufactured by different companies to the same specification. And if I look at the next slide, I just want to reinforce that point about accreditation. It's been a successful accreditation for the last 12 years, much sought after. Mortgage lenders and other financial institutions continue to ask MMC manufacturers for this accreditation, which is delivered by Build Offsite and LRQA, which includes methodology assessments, durability assessments, and inspections and surveillance visits. It's a very rigorous process. And 100 companies have been accredited since 2013, and then another 7 are going to receive their certificates at the BOPAS Forum on the 11th of June, which I'll come back to later. But I also wanted to mention BOPAS Plus. It's one of our latest additions to our product suite, and that actually covers an emerging trend, which are applied methodologies within the digital space and the offsite spectrum. And now I want to come on to PAS 8700 itself, and just show you in the next slide that the Minister was right. It did require a huge effort to deliver the PAS. We are very pleased with the collaborative process that Suzanne mentioned. It worked really well. The industry-wide outcomes were universally supported and accepted. We were approached in 2023 to join the group, and credit and thanks is due to our offsite experts within Build Offsite, Nigel and Ken, who are our representatives conveying the member thoughts and views on what was required in this PAS 8700. Next slide, please. So looking at the PAS itself, I think in strategic terms, Build Offsite members are delighted that it's been published. There's always been this lack of knowledge about the art of the possible with MMC. We believe the government needs to help our practitioners develop their understanding of the capabilities and the benefits of MMC systems and products. And that's why this PAS is so timely and potentially impactful. The new PAS brings together in one document a common language, processes and procedures focused on the use of MMC in the housing sector. And I think it identifies areas where, if, as Suzanne mentioned, if an early consideration of an MMC approach is applied in the correct way, we will make a significant difference to successful delivery of house building projects. And as Suzanne mentioned, you often forget that there are a myriad of regulations and legislation out there. And she mentioned the fire safety regulations coming in. I think this helps practitioners implementing MMC avoid potential pitfalls such as non-compliance with those regulations. And the point that I made earlier that Suzanne mentioned, I think needs to be highlighted time and time and again. The MMC advisor is a critical component. It's a cog in the wheel we are missing at the moment, because no project manager has the skill set to cover every aspect through the lifetime of a major MMC project. As Suzanne mentioned, we're talking about whole life here, not just commissioning, design and build. We're talking about maintenance and all the way through to decommissioning. And an MMC advisor will bring that intimate knowledge of offsite benefits as well as the challenges and offer impartial advice. So this appointment and training of an MMC advisor, whether it's internal or external, would make a big difference to the success of a project. The next slide really tackles some of the other aspects which I think are worth highlighting. It's a comprehensive PAS, and I think that will help dispel some of the misperceptions about MMC, especially in housing. And I don't know if we can just click on some of the images. There we are. So I just wanted to show you an image on the bottom right-hand corner there. It's an image of the Weir housing development, and that's post-war. It's one of several post-war examples of houses built using non-traditional methods. So MMC has been around for decades. The word modern, which sometimes mystifies some of our members, is perhaps not really appropriate anymore. And industrialized construction is perhaps a better term, as has been mentioned. But I think the most important thing to mention here is that PAS really demonstrates the value of MMC benefits. It really is needed to stress that, because it's always been a challenge for our members when it comes to talking to project teams who still tend to look at lower cost rather than added value. And this comes up in performance specifications and procurement as well. And I also want to pay credit to the PAS team for the way they've formatted the PAS, the project walkthrough, the key diagrams. They're all valuable tools, I think, in helping understand more about MMC. And as Suzanne mentioned, this PAS is for everyone, regardless of your role or involvement in construction projects. And therefore, it does have the potential to have a pretty big impact on clients and stakeholders who have no technical knowledge of MMC at all. And just at the bottom there, I referenced some other excellent guidance already out there, such as the construction playbook and the definition framework. And obviously, I'm going to recommend reading the build offsite guidance when it comes out. Next slide, please. I think the wider adoption of MMC will be significantly aided by this newly published standard. There's no question about that. But I also want to flag up the wider industry context and the need for other robust standards. The build offsite advisors I mentioned earlier, Nigel and Ken, have been and continue to be involved in other standards which are specifically related to MMC or incorporate aspects. I can only just think of the BSI Flex 390, but also the Circular Economy Standard. I mention the latter standard because it's often forgotten that actually the benefits of MMC do lead directly to embedding sustainability and driving net zero carbon on major construction projects. I have a lot of members who are at the forefront of leading in that particular battle. And all these standards highlight these benefits. And that's just brilliant to see. So the whole mix of these standards together, I think, are very powerful. I just want to finish off by highlighting relevant events coming up. So you can find out more about BOPAS on the 11th of June. It's a free event coupled with a factory tour at Laing O'Rourke and workshop. And then on the 1st of July, we're actually publishing our guidance on MMC performance specifications, which is really closely aligned to PAS, supported by BSI and many government departments and publicly funded bodies. And then on the 17th of July, I just want to flag up a webinar advocating the use of low carbon materials in MMC in the housing sector. So I hope to see you there. Thank you.
No, that's brilliant, Dirk. Thank you very much for that. Really interesting and timely to see the launch of your manifesto. And as you noted there, how closely everything aligns together, which is really good to see this kind of unified narrative coming through to the built environment. What I'd please like to do is, can I invite Suzanne, Dirk and Richard to join us on camera so we can get to the Q&A portion of the session. I have seen a bunch of questions coming through. Some of them look quite interesting, so I'm sure we can chew on a few of them, which would be great. So what we'll do is we'll get started straight away. So the first one I've got is a pre-submitted question, and I'll aim it first to Suzanne and Richard, which is effectively, how have the comments from the public consultation been received and incorporated into the final version of the PAS? And as a kind of bonus part of that, what were the key takeaways that you saw from the public consultation?
Okay, thank you, Dan. So the first thing I think to point out is we saw a lot of comments, like quite a high percentage, were referencing and focused on changing building legislation. So as I mentioned in my presentation, this was something that we decided to really foreground in the beginning of the PAS, doing this job to really set the scene properly, and then for it then not to be something that needed to be repeated throughout the PAS. And it and we wouldn't want to replicate legislation because of the risk of interpretation. So it's important that we reference changes, and we have made sure that, as I mentioned again in the presentation, it's aligned to key recent publications like BS 9991 and BS 999. So that's foreground at the beginning of the PAS. And then maybe the other thing to point out is that a large number of the comments were also on those early sections of the PAS. So whether our readers ran out of steam, but I think it's more to do with this idea of MMC being a century-old concept that has an awful lot of baggage that comes with it. And as I tried to point out in my presentation, it's, there are lots of preconceptions. You might immediately think of volumetric or panelized, when actually it also includes these kind of minor wins, which can add up to be really significant, like site-based process improvements. So I think a lot of the kind of rewriting and recasting of the PAS after the public consultation was to get those early sections of the PAS hopefully right, and do a really good job of trying to explain, both in the introduction, the kind of wider ecosystem behind MMC, and then in section 4, the kind of that what I characterize as right people, right time. So getting the setting up the team and thinking early enough about how procurement might be different. And then I'm just going to suggest Richard maybe comes in with some more specific examples from later in the PAS.
Yeah, it's very interesting sort of reviewing all of the comments that came from public consultation. Of course, that review was done by the whole steering group. So both the technical authors and in a series of steering group meetings, all of those comments were discussed. It's quite interesting how many came from people who have really good knowledge and experience in MMC, and we're pointing out lots of misunderstandings. So both in the sort of early stages of procurement and design, but also in around some of the processes of compliance and what things are approved. And an example would be, for instance, a comment about misunderstandings of the roles of, say, fire protecting linings when a system has a combustible structure. And the way that those were addressed were actually not to then write a clause that is entirely devoted to fire protecting linings, but actually to think about how an understanding of the role of a layer of fire protection influences the other decisions on the sort of MMC journey. So there are paragraphs and clauses very early on when, for instance, system selection has been considered. So does a client organization really understand the implications of fire protection in terms of an ongoing maintenance and management responsibility. There are clauses to do with the appointment and selection of team members, so they have the right experience of the right systems and technology. There are clauses that refer to fire protection when we're talking about resilience. And then, of course, at the handover information at the end, does the building manager understand that very small inadvertent changes to a building can often have an implication for something much more substantial or serious, for instance, fire protection. So the PAS trying to weave in those considerations at different points in the kind of structure of a whole MMC project. And that applied to many different technical aspects. And I think although we had a lot of comments, actually there were recurring themes that were very helpfully incorporated in the restructuring and in the advice from the steering group.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you for that. I'm going to go off piece and go for one of the live questions. And Dirk, I'll start it with you, just to forewarn you, so we know who I want to answer. More so because I think it's a slight challenge, and I'm always fond of bringing up challenges when they appear. And the question is it basically sums it into great work, but disappointed in it having MMC as a term proliferate through it when there seems to be the shift to that kind of industrialized construction sort of language from places. So I think it's only fair to bring it to light. But I guess maybe we'll start cheekily with you, Dirk, in that would you want it to have been titled industrialized construction or not as build off site? And then maybe then Suzanne and Richard, you can talk about the conversations around what things are or aren't and maybe how some of that evolved in the development. But Dirk, over to you.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that question because I touched on it in my presentation, and it's a live debate our members are having as well. And I think it's reflected in what Suzanne said earlier. Getting the definitions right at the start of the PAS is critical because there will be confusion about which term means what particularly. So I think I would sort of caution against throwing away terms that the industry has been using and is used to using, if that makes sense, because the architects will obviously refer to a REBA DFMA guidance, and manufacturers might refer to pre-manufacturing or assembly. So it really is about which audience you're trying to get to. And I think this new PAS is trying to also get, Suzanne has mentioned it, I've mentioned it, we're trying to get to everyone, which also means you're trying to get to non-technical people who have no understanding whatsoever, even don't understand what MMC means, let alone what industrialized construction might mean. So there is a great conference coming up called Industrialized Construction, which is coming up in June, organized by Offsite Expo. I'd recommend going to that. I think they'll tackle some of these issues. But I think at the moment, because you're trying to get to a number of different audiences, especially a traditional audience as well, that's used to using a traditional methods of construction, I wouldn't be adverse to using them all just to start with, but as long as you explain them.
No, that's super helpful. Suzanne and Richard.
Okay. So yeah, it's something I suppose it's not too much of a cop out. It was something we inherited, like the title and the use of the term MMC. But as Dirk points out, we do try and bring in some of the newer concepts, like industrialized construction, product platforms, kits of parts, and I think try and set that balance between writing to, I talked about this really broad focus. It's a real challenge of writing. So you're writing to a non-technical audience member who probably hasn't necessarily heard of, maybe doesn't understand the full idea of what MMC is. It's very hard, even as ourselves, to understand it, and also maybe not even heard of DFMA, or an audience who are kind of au fait with more wider construction industry terms like industrialized construction. So I think what we tried to be very clear about is how we were using terms in the past to actually kind of hone in and use the terms we needed, but not try and add any extra ones in. We weren't trying to make a glossary. We kind of maybe started down that route and realized down that route and realized it was maybe a bit of a red herring, and there are other, you know, really worthwhile industry bodies who've either provided their own glossaries or, you know, there's a
Yeah.
whole key definition framework, so we can refer out to that. And we're also aware that through the work of CB 301 committee, there's lots of work going on in the background to review those frameworks and those definitions. So we, to some extent, I suppose, sidestepped it in the past just by trying to be really precise about the language we were using and to maybe hedge our bets and use several terms throughout.
No, super helpful. Thank you. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so I think we might have to keep our answers short on some of the questions as we keep going through. The next one, I'm going to combine a pre-submitted question with a live question, just to try and get through a few. So interestingly, I think live, we've got questions about how does this PAS support procurers, insurers, warrantors, and that sort of thing. I know that there's a pre-submitted question about how it affects some of the assurance bodies, with, I think, BOPAS being cited as one of the examples. So I guess, Dirk, maybe we can start with you, obviously from the BOPAS point, but maybe then, Susanna, Richard, if you want to go in succinctly afterwards around how it might support procurers, that would be helpful. Dirk.
Yeah, I think you've noticed from my presentation that given the alignment we have in quite a few of the aspects that are embodied within the PAS, we will most probably see that the BOPAS accreditation will look at that really carefully. We're still in the process of considering it internally, but I think it will be a benefit to that assessment process. And we will come back to you on that. We have a BOPAS forum on the 11th of June, and I'm sure that'll be a topic of debate there as well. So watch this space.
Thank you. Susanna, Richard, anything to add from the procurers?
Just Dan, just that insurance and mortgageability are really important issues, and we've tried to emphasise that as much as we can in the past.
No, brilliant, thank you. I've seen a couple of questions on some of the standards side, so I'll quickly answer one or two of those, and then we'll get to something crunchier. So a live question is asked about the difference between PAS 8700 and CP 301. We've also got some questions around, is this the only standard we're getting, and what other things might be happening? So to answer that very briefly for everyone, I think Dirk helpfully cited some of it on his presentation there, but CB 301 is the national committee that we have for things like offsite MMC and industrialized construction. It mirrors the ISO committee TC59 SC19 on prefabricated buildings, and they've got their own portfolio of work that's happening. There's things like some work on terms and definitions. They're doing some classification work. There's some work on bathroom pods, some thermal bridging work. There's a whole portfolio of formal standards that are working in that space at the moment. And we as BSI are helping to curate that international work, looking at the national work that CP301 are interested in doing. In particular, they're very interested in looking at refining the MMC categories, and actually if there's a way that we can have more of a systematic rule base behind them, which looks quite fascinating. And at the same time, I think we're exploring the needs of the sector of things that we can do in addition to the PAS. So I think one question is asked about different building types, because obviously there's a focus here on residential developments, but what about things that aren't residential developments, and could they get similar support, as well as other areas? So I think in essence, I think you just watch this space, as I think we might see PAS 8700 as the foundation that we actually build a lot of the other content off of. So I think it's a great place to start. So just noting that quickly. Then in terms of some of the other questions we got through, there are about 3 or 4 questions. Interestingly, they're asking about the relationship between PAS 8700 and the BIM standards, ISO 19650. So if I remember right, Susanna, Richard, I think is it 511? There's a whole section, I think, on information management in the standard, but I don't know if you're able to expand a little on that. If not, I think I've got a copy somewhere, and I might be able to expand on it if I haven't put you too much in the spotlight.
Yeah, I think maybe it might be something to follow up later, but yes, there is a whole section on information management, which we had some really great help writing from members of the steering group and from Dan himself as well. So, and it does align with the ISO standard.
Yeah, and that gave me enough time to flick it onto the screen to remember some of the details. So thank you. I mean, yeah. So there's a dedicated section there on information management. It cites things like ISO 19650, BS 7000 Part 4, which is our design management standard, and it talks about the things you might expect around information delivery planning, which is quite core to 19650, document management and control aspects, and links to concepts like the common data environment, and also talks about digital tools to some extent as well, about some of the considerations that you should have there. So whilst not intrinsically linked, they are, I think, well aligned and can support each other. And particularly when you look at some of the work that's happened around platforms and digital kit of parts and things, it starts to kind of overlap with each other there. So it's just been done with that kind of in mind in that way.
Yeah, so trying to set the balance between you know, all the opportunity you've got with more digitized MMC, but then equally trying to be accessible and not set to, you know, higher bar for allowing, you know, smaller SME type organizations to adopt and use the PAS as well. So trying to set a balance in terms of complexity.
Also, Dan, trying also to emphasize the relevance of information once the production manufacturing has happened, the buildings are built and handed over. So it's that continuity into the management and use and occupation stages. There's often a lot of discussion about sort of execution plans at the beginning of a project and not enough thought of who's actually going to use the information in the future. So we've tried to highlight that as well.
Mm-hmm. And how that information gets passed on to future occupiers as well, you know, really thinking about the people who are going to be living in buildings and homes and how they might want to be adapting them in future. As we touched on earlier, it can be quite minor, you know, like improving a bathroom or redoing your kitchen that could even impact, say, fire protection for a lightweight system, for instance.
No, really interesting. Thank you. We might have time for one or two more questions, depending on how we get the answers out. This one, I think I'll start with you, Dirk, is that we've got a question here. Do you think volume house builders, and he gives an example of one, but I'll skip naming people for now, will embrace MMC if it requires a degree of retooling and effectively changing their processes when there's an availability of cheap labor at the moment? So I guess it's around this idea of the cost of investing in this versus maybe perhaps the benefits you could see. So maybe from a build off-site view, how do you think volume house builders going to react to the PAS and maybe that general adoption of MMC more generally?
I think that's obviously a tricky question in the sense that there are some really good examples of house builders already leading by example and delivering house building through MMC. But at the same time, I raised it myself earlier, and I'm really pleased that the minister also touched on it. The house building sector will want to see the government removing barriers to growth and particularly stimulating pipeline in its sector. And that's the perennial issue that, you know, Suzanne touched on it. Some of the challenges we've had in this industry are to do with lack of pipeline, lack of scale. And maybe we have to find some financial incentives or other measures, triggers, which will get the house building sector in the right place, primed to then scale up. Because I think that's what's needed, a more bespoke solution to the residential sector is I think required. And I think the government, I was really encouraged by the minister's words this morning. I think the government is thinking in along those terms.
No, brilliant. Thank you. Suzanne, Richard, is there anything you want to add to that, or no? That's fine. So what I'll do is I'll make this one the last question. There are a couple that we haven't been able to answer, but what we'll do is we will maybe send those around our panel, and if they do have answers they want to give, then maybe we include that as part of a post-event document. So apologies for that. I think we'll go to everyone for this one. I mean, we'll start with Susanna, Richard, and then we'll finish off with Dirk, because I think it's quite a nice one. How should modular companies approach and look to align to the PAS? So maybe almost like, I've heard about the document, I probably think I should do it. What steps should I take? So maybe what's a helpful first, second step that an organization should take in looking at adopting the standard? And maybe Susanna, we can start with you.
Okay. Well, I suppose it is a kind of coherent document. Maybe it's so it's maybe important to explain that it does probably need to be looked at as a whole. Because you need to, it, as we explained, it walks through a project, so it is probably important. I would say when you're first like wanting to get a handle on it and understand it, I'd maybe try and look at the contents list, read the headings, understand how we walk through that project, and then perhaps for particularly for client bodies who might be reading it, would be to really read that first section about the introduction, about setting the landscape, and then also the setting up the team section. And then I suppose very broadly after that, you might say that section 5 is really the design section. So that would be where your designers, engineers, practitioners would be looking. And then section 6 is particularly focused more for like how those questions that have been set up maybe in section 5 get answered in section 6 by the system manufacturers. 7 then all about delivery, and then the final sections are about installation on site, 8, and testing, 9, and then 10 and 11 quality and information handover. So I suppose the answer is do need to look at all of it, but there are maybe particular sections to prioritize that you could pick through to try and get a handle before signing up to the whole thing.
So Dan, I think you'd hope that the PAS becomes a kind of common reference point for discussions. So people really understanding the landscape that it sets out and understanding the things that it emphasizes, so that a client organization, a system supplier, somebody in procurement, a designer, a planner even, can all have a conversation that's got one really good authoritative reference point. I think that would be our main ambition for it, really.
No, brilliant. And I think it sounds like would work quite well as a tool for early stakeholder engagement in that way then, in that actually you could show them the individual sections that might be most pertinent to them to begin with, and that might be the teaser to get them to look at the rest of the document perhaps. No, thank you. Dirk, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to pick up on Richard's point, it's like with other Syria and Bill of Site guidance, it is a reference point for practitioners like architects and designers to actually use in practice. But on the point about what do modular companies do with it, they were reflected in the steering group, so their views were reflected. So we hope that we've actually, I mean, it's credit to Suzanne and Richard, really. We've seen a PAS being written in terms that they will understand. But the most important thing, Richard mentioned discussion. I think the modular company needs to go to the client and have that discussion with them and try to get buy-in. So it's a great starting point, great icebreaker, as it were, if you are at those early stage discussions with the client about whether to use MMC or not. And then lastly, I would say it's like all other guidance, it's an iterative document. I would argue BSI will want to hear the feedback from modular companies, how it's been discussed, what's been done with it, has it been used in practice? Perhaps it will lead, that's one for Dan to answer, it will lead to a revised PAS in a couple of years' time.
Yeah, no doubt it will, and that's a really good idea. And my 2 cents of, I think, next steps, probably the first one is read the PAS. We talked about it's publicly available, it's free at point of use, so there's no harm of just downloading it and reading it. Is the first step. I think the second one is probably engage with communities. So we've heard from obviously Dirk today from Build Offsite. We've got people like Gainer and the Offsite Alliance. There are great communities out there to support off-site and industrialized construction. This isn't going to be the only event. We've already heard from the forums and stuff that Build Off-Site can be running. I'm sure there's going to be a series of events from the Offsite Alliance and stuff as well. So I think engage with like-minded people in your communities and professional institutions, learn from each other as we go forward, and then make sure then they then can collect your feedback and come to us. And then they can say, well, actually, it's been brilliant, but we struggled with this clause or this section. I can help then improve the standard in the future as well. So it works in a really nice cycle. So thank you all for that. I think as it's hitting 2 o'clock, we're going to end the Q&A there. I'm just going to sum up. So thank you, Suzanne, Richard, and Dirk for that. So thank you for joining. There was really good answers. Very much appreciate that. And I think my closing comments are going to be that you have a link to the standard, you have the ability to look at it. I'm very excited to see what's going to come of it. As the Minister Norris said at the start, there's some real impacts that could come from this. I think not just from trying to achieve our ambitious national housing targets, but to actually look at how we move the dial in terms of industrializing the built environment. And I do genuinely think that this could be the most impactful standard that we as BSI publish this year. So hopefully after this, you've been inspired to read it, to have a look at it, and see how it might impact you and your organization. So with that, I will say thank you very much for listening. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.